Hello, I'm Lynn Drew at HarperCollins, and I'm really thrilled to be talking to Roxane Dhand today, who is the author of The Pearler's Wife, a really brilliant, unputdownable, gripping historical novel set in 1912 in England and Australia. And Rox has really kindly come in to answer a few questions and tell us a bit about her writing experience. So welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Rox, first of all, I know the question you must get asked a lot, and certainly I'm sure I asked you it. What gave you the first idea for the book? What sparked it for you?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Lynn, because I wasn't, at the time, I was in northwest Australia in Broome, which was the actual real life background for the book. I wasn't actually looking particularly for something to write, but it's funny what sets the creative hair running. And I suppose there were a number of things that sort of triggered my imagination, if you like. Firstly, I hadn't appreciated how far north Broome is actually from Perth, where I was staying with my sister at the time. And then suddenly, when we arrived in this, backwater town, I began to think, well, communication is pretty difficult in the 21st century. What must it have been like in the 20th century when a letter took 6 months backwards and forwards to England? So that kind of
pre-air travel and
exactly, and it is just so remote. In the early 20th century, Broome had been the centre of the pearl fishing industry worldwide, and that divers used to dive for mother of pearl, and not the actual pearl within it, which is what I thought.
Yes.
So my view was rather different, because I thought the mother of pearl was the actual byproduct of the pearl fishing industry, when in fact actually it was quite the reverse.
Because it was used for buttons and
yes, it was a luxury item. It was used for compass faces, for buttons, obviously, cutlery handles, inlay, marquetry, that sort of thing.
Yeah, stuff we've almost sort of forgotten.
Exactly.
But it was a really essential part of life.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So when I started to dig a bit deeper, and I did the tourist thing, and I realised that there was quite an industry there. And if you sort of make a comparison with life today, it was probably $1 billion business.
Yes. Yeah.
400 luggers, which I now know are the pearling boats. 4,000 indentured workers. It was a very, very big deal.
Yeah, no, a huge thing. And I think what for me, one of the things you do so brilliantly with the novelist's eye is take a young English girl, a girl who's really had very little experience of the world at all, and put her in that backwater town that has such extraordinary values. And I did you have to research that period a lot, 1912, just before the Great War, or did you feel you knew it reasonably well?
Well, I mean, I've always been a great fan of period dramas, so I'm like probably the rest of the world, I'd watched Downton Abbey, so I had a vague idea. But translating that knowledge from the UK to Australia did take an awful lot of research.
Yes,
and I was very lucky in that the Historical Society in Broome were incredibly helpful. They gave me access to albums, literally albums of sepia photographs, so I could imagine, actually see what the diving dress looked like, what people were wearing, what the homesteads were like, the indigenous population, how they were almost faceless people. I remember one particular photograph I looked at. There was an entire family sitting down having tea, and they all had their names underneath, but the domestic help, the Aboriginal nanny, she was nameless. And I don't know whether that's because they didn't know her name or whether she was just so unimportant they didn't bother to name her.
Yeah, and I think again one of the things that I felt you captured really well was how, although we think of it as a really long time ago, over 100 years ago, but Maisie, the heroine, is really wanting to be someone more modern, and she is slightly horrified by the town's insistence on old traditions, almost Victorian traditions of how they took tea, how they had to dress for dinner. And
it was a very big shock for her. Because obviously she'd come from that environment. but it was slightly more liberal, I suppose, because we were talking about the suffragette time, and ladies were beginning to question what they could and couldn't do in their own values, and then to find herself transported, thousands and thousands of miles away, to a community that were practicing all those values, that had no first-hand experience of them, and she just thought it was, hypocrisy with a capital H.
Yeah, and also, I guess, felt like going backwards to her.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I know I asked you this, perhaps when we were doing the edits or something, but what would Maisie have done if she wasn't, if she hadn't been shipped off to be married? What do you think she might have been able to do in the UK? Would the suffragette movement have called her?
Well, I think she was very much a product of her upbringing and her environment. So, I mean, we talk in the book about her wanting to be a nurse, and her mother said that she didn't have the intellectual capacity to follow a regime of study. And I think that going to Australia brought out the best in her, because I think adversity, made her dig deep and realise that and start to question things.
Yes.
But I think it's a good question of yours, had she stayed at home, I think she would have aligned herself to the suffragette movement.
Yeah, because we of course think of it as 100 years ago from now, that the women for the first time began to be able to vote, but of course it was years in the making, decades in the making even.
It was, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very early days, because it was very early days, but I would like to think that that's what she would have done.
Yes, yeah, me too.
Change herself to a railing somewhere.
I know. Of course, what she does instead is uncover a whole lot of secrets, secrets that aren't just don't just relate to the town and to what's happening within this what would now be $1 billion industry, but that relate to her own family as well. And I think the uncovering of those two threads is what makes the book so powerful and such a great read. And I know that one of the questions I'm sure you'll be asked a lot as well is, so when you'd had the idea, how did you actually start to write the book? How long did it take you? And did you sit down and it just flowed from your finger into your computer, or?
Well, it was quite a long process actually. I think it took me about a year to get the first draft down. Yeah. Because what I wanted to do, I wanted to make it very realistic. So I was reading a lot of primary source material. So I would come across an event, for example, in the book we see Coop signing a contract with one of the Pearling bosses. And that actually happened in history, but the diver who signed the contract realised what he'd signed and he ripped it out of the book. So I thought I would fictionalise that by using that incident, but then I decided that Coop couldn't read or write. So therefore he'd signed something but he didn't know what he'd signed, and so that's what I tried to do the whole way through, that I would read primary source material to give me an idea of something that I could use so that it was appropriate to the context. And that took a long time.
Yeah, I can imagine. And once you were writing, did you finish the book before you tried to find a publisher? How did you, again, I'm sure a really popular question, but how did you manage to secure a publisher or an agent in the first place?
Well, once I'd finished the first draft, I realised it needed work, and I didn't know how to make it better, so I found myself an independent editor who was very, very good. And then we worked on that probably for another year, so we're now 2 years after starting the book. And I'd always had at the back of my mind that I didn't want to self-publish, that I wanted to try and go the traditional publishing route, just to prove to myself really that, I actually could write something that was publishable. So I was incredibly fortunate that I went through the laborious submission process, and I was picked up very, very quickly by Blake Friedman, and they offered me representation pretty much overnight. So I was just incredibly lucky.
And they're one of the longest standing literary agencies in London, and with a great reputation, so that was. But I mean, it's not just luck, it's because the book was good.
Well, I mean, there are an awful lot of talented writers out there who just don't get the breaks. And I was very lucky that I was picked up. And then of course they were able to place me with you.
Yes, and Australia.
And,
where you
and
have
with Australia as well, where I have a different publisher.
Yeah, no, it was fantastically exciting. And any advice for authors who are also trying to get published or get agented? Would you say persevere, or did you use the Writers and Artists Yearbook?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And I was quite disciplined on how I was going to present my material, and I'd sought advice on that as well, because it's important. Busy editors have a finite amount of time to actually look at new submissions, so you have got to answer their criteria, and they're all different. And it is a laborious formulaic procedure, but
it's
worth
really
it.
important.
And it's really important.
Well, thank you so much, Rox. It's
Not
been a
at all.
pleasure.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure.